Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Kelsey. I'm the creator of Bite-Sized Ancient History and a recent graduate of Cambridge University. At university, I studied classics at undergraduate level and then Egyptology at masters. So I thought I'd put together a series this year where we discuss the historical fact and the historical fiction of our favourite TV shows and films. If you are already following, you may be aware of the fact that I've been doing every single episode of Moon Knight, and unfortunately we're now getting to the end, because today we're going to be discussing episode 5. If this sounds like the kind of content you might be interested in, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so that you don't miss out on future videos, and also turn on the bell icon. Generally, if you're interested in fun, ancient historical content, don't forget to also check out my other social media platforms. So without further ado, let's get into it. Major spoiler warnings ahead if you haven't seen episode 5 yet. You might want to just save this video and come back to it later. For those of you that have seen episode 5, you'll know that it suddenly got very dark and very emotional. Because of this, I'm going to be attaching some links down below for any of you who have been affected by some of the themes brought up by this episode. Firstly, let's talk about the goddess Taweret. We already spoke about this goddess very briefly in my review of the first episode of Moon Knight, because they've obviously foreshadowed it a little bit, where before they had the cuddly toy of Taweret and now we meet the real version of her. Because of that, I'm not going to go into too much detail in her unique properties because I kind of reviewed it then. Instead, I'm just going to talk about her role in this episode. So this very cool hippo goddess tells Mark and Steve that she's here to guide them to the field of reeds in their journey to the afterlife. This is like 50% accurate. As many people on TikTok have commented, it wasn't really Taweret's job to do this. However, she was somewhat involved in Egyptian mythology. In the Book of the Dead, we're told that it was her job to guide the deceased through the mountains of the west in the underworld. The Egyptian underworld was a very large, complex place with many stages and challenges to overcome, so she was in charge of this aspect of the underworld journey, but not the one that we see her in this episode. To my knowledge, I couldn't really find any evidence where she is the one captaining the boat of the underworld, or most commonly known as the solar bark. The main god that we really see in relation to this solar bark or boat is the god Ra, not Taweret. There are often also other gods accompanying Ra in this journey to kind of help and protect him, but we'll get to this a little bit later. On the boat, we also see this weighing scales, which we've talked a lot about in the previous episodes and my previous videos. And sometimes she is described as being present at this scene, but not all the time. So like I said, like 50-50 accurate. I'm not sure why they chose to go with her and not one of the other gods, but this is when I also wanted to make a kind of side note on the fact that during this we have Steve/Mark coming in and out of consciousness in this therapy room, what's it called, like a clinic, with Harrow. And in this, as a therapist, Harrow talks about the fact that is Mark or Steve describing a hippo goddess before him nonsense or sense? And I feel like this was an interesting point, like my friend brought up. Like in the MCU, we have seen aliens and other gods, so kind of sense, because we're presuming this is taking part in the main MCU. They haven't told us that it's not. So I thought that was interesting. But back to the history and mythology. When we meet Taweret, she says how she's going to guide them through the land of DUAT. And then, weirdly, Oscar Isaac's like British accent was like, DUAT? We'll ignore it because he is a very good actor aside from that. So if you don't know a lot about Egyptian funerary texts, don't worry. I don't know why you'd know it in depth unless you are really into it like myself and an Egyptologist. There are many different versions. Because it is such a huge period of Egyptian history, you're going to have variations. So this means that we have many different texts with slightly varying narratives and ideas. Our idea of what is understood as DUAT comes from the Book of the Gates, the Book of Caverns, the Book of the Dead, and the Journey of Two Ways. This is just to name a few. We know that the DUAT is their concept of the underworld or an afterlife, as we see in other ancient religions like in ancient Greece, or as we get in modern Christianity with this idea of hell. However, unlike that, it isn't inherently good or bad. There's good and bad sections within this landscape. And its landscape is vast and complex. So we actually have some coffins, very, very rare, that depict this landscape, and we see lots of rivers and mountains and monsters, ferocious beasts they have to overcome, gods that are friendly to help them, and so much more. And these books and this map on the coffin kind of acts as a guide to help the deceased on their journey to the afterlife, so they have a hint of what's coming and how to prepare and take it on. The boat or solar bark that I mentioned earlier is then what is used principally by the god Ra to journey through the DUAT. Why did he have to journey through the DUAT? Ra is a solar god, naturally, as he travels on a solar bark. So their 24-hour period was mapped out through this journey. So when he is in the sky above them, it is daytime. He is travelling as the sun, as we see it. When it's nighttime and there is no light, he is in the underworld, or the DUAT. And he himself also has to overcome certain challenges. Specifically, his main foe is a creature called Apep, which is this lizard snake-like creature. And he has to defeat it every night in order for the new day to start and for him to be reborn and revivified. With this revivification, he also revivifies the deceased. It's what recharges their soul or their spirit. Your everyday deceased wouldn't be accompanying the god in his journey. They would just be harnessing this rejuvenating power of the journey. Pharaohs, however, would hope to do this because they'd be taking on the power of a king like themselves. Flashback again to our first interaction with Taweret. Steve mentions the fact that we have the destination, which is the field of reeds, or Aru, and this is very accurate within Egyptian mythology. This is exactly what we call this area of the DUAT. It is your final destination which we're aiming for, to live a happy afterlife. And generally, as Egyptologists, we believe it's because it's the most idealized version of the life that most Egyptian workers would have known. They would have been working in the fields and they would have been struggling, depending on a certain harvest. If it would fail or succeed would determine whether they got to eat that day, basically. So their idea of this final glorified destination is this perfect version where there's always crops, there's always food, hence the field of reeds. But of course, as we've said, you have to undergo many challenges to prove your worth to get there, i.e. the weighing of the heart, i.e. conquering certain monsters and beasts. Again, if you missed my first video, I go into a lot more detail on the weighing of the heart scene, so go check that out, because for those that have seen it, I don't want to force you to listen to me repeating that information again. Speaking of challenges, in the episode we see that Steve and Mark are having to relive their memories and kind of remedy the issues that they've had in the past. This isn't really a challenge that you would have had to have undergone as an ancient Egyptian, according to the text we have. However, I think it's kind of a Hollywood, Disney way of representing these challenges, because it is in itself a challenge which they have to pass in order to have the pure heart which is needed for the afterlife. Because without rectifying these issues in the past, you can't have a pure soul, and therefore your heart will outweigh the feather and you will not pass because you're not enough. You're not a good enough individual. We're also told that if you fail the weighing of the heart scene, you will be devoured and killed by the deceased who had previously failed it. Again, not quite accurate. The most common punishment would be that you would be devoured by Amit. So it's a bit weird that they haven't picked up on that, but I guess it's because that's kind of another section of the story that we're going to come to. It's not so much the lost souls that are going to eat you, it is Amit. However, we do have a concept called the roaming dead as a rough translation, or as Mut. And these were the people who had also lost their way because they had failed their passage into the afterlife, or because their body hadn't been preserved, so therefore their spirit was kind of destroyed and they're now left in this halfway area. And we do know that citizens of Egypt would kind of fear these, as we have certain spells to protect themselves against these people. However, they were not inherently evil spirits. They were neither good or bad. They could have a bad example or a good example. So at least there's kind of inspiration there, it's just not quite right. In a flashback, we see Mark in a temple in Egypt belonging to Khonshu, and this is when he becomes Khonshu's avatar. Again, unfortunately, there are different styles of Egyptian temple, but not quite like the one we find here. The idea that in the main entry hall that there would be a grand statue of this nature is a little bit more ancient Greek than ancient Egyptian. Generally, temples of this scale in Egypt would have many courts and halls prior to the cult statue. Because it was so sacred, you would want to protect it. So the general Egyptian temple layout, if you're interested, would be to have this peri-style court that you walk into, i.e. there's loads of columns surrounding you. And you may have a few statues here, but not one in the centre as we see in Moon Knight. You would then have a hippo-style hall, and again this is lots of columns, but in this slightly different layout, and this is representative of wreaths. Finally, you might have the inner sanctuary, and this is where you would find the cult statue, and it generally wouldn't have been available to the public, because again, you want to protect it and its holy nature. While we're talking about Khonshu, let's talk a little bit more about this deity. In previous episodes, I've spoken a lot about him, but I don't know if I've touched on the nature which they highlight in this episode, which is the idea that he was a protector of the night travellers. And this is simply because, as we know, the moon illuminates the night sky and adds a certain layer of protection if you are out and about at night. And this is very important in somewhere like Egypt, where you not only have dangerous people you might come across at night, but also dangerous animals. So it is just this illuminating quality that makes him the protector of these travellers. Interesting, some Egyptologists then also choose to present the fact that his name could be a translation of traveller. And this is the idea that the moon travels across the sky also. This flashback gets broken off when we start to hear and see baboons running through the boat. And I really liked this kind of Easter egg-like detail because they're very important when it comes to this journey and the passage of time. We see baboon imagery from the very beginning of ancient Egyptian history because they played a very important role. In certain Book of the Dead scenes, we see how they are the protectors of one of these challenges that the deceased must face, which is the Lake of Fire. So it makes sense that we see him here in the DUAT. It is also because in Egypt, during these earlier periods of history when they were still present, they would be very loudly shouting and screaming as the sun rose each morning. So baboon imagery became associated with sunrise, and this is because they're coming to the end of their journey in the DUAT and ultimately going up to where we are now. You know what I mean, the sky, whatever, you get my point. It's daytime. Finally, the episode ends with the gates of Osiris. How real is this? Unfortunately, again, not quite. I'm really sad to say. And this is one of my favourite episodes, but it's probably one of the least accurate. But it kind of pacifies Egyptologists because it has lots of niche details like the baboons, as I just said. So I'm not angry. Gates were a very real and important feature in the DUAT, or the underworld. For example, in the Field of Reeds, some funerary texts talk about there being 21 gates. And these were secret portals to the mansion of Osiris. So maybe we're using that, but obviously we're not in the Field of Reeds yet, and I don't think we're aiming to get to the mansion of Osiris, we're aiming to get back to the world of the living. In the journey in the DUAT, where we talk about Ra and his solar bark and how it's broken into kind of 12 sections or 12 hours, there is a gate each time to represent that. So it could be we're going through the final 12th gate. However, more traditionally, this gate is protected by the goddesses Isis and Nephthys. But we can allow it because for a series that is so heavily based in the idea of the underworld and the afterlife, we haven't really had Osiris yet. So I get why we'd use him here instead because he's just more well known. And I think that is all we're going to have time for today. So thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week for the final episode of Moon Knight. Bye!